Welcome back to another episode of Fantastic Descriptions, a YouTube channel that explores the art of narrative description as used by game masters and dungeon masters in role-playing games. We've been talking about, for the last few episodes, combat description, and we're going to continue on in that vein, looking a little bit more specifically and in more detail to, I guess what you would call basically the nuts and bolts of combat itself, thinking about the action rolls, the dice rolls that you make to indicate whether or not something is a hit or a miss, how different things play out in the combat scenario turn by turn. One of the great challenges of narrating or describing combat is balancing the need to convey information with the need to create some sort of compelling pace or dynamic to the game. It's easy to veer too far into one side and become simply a summary of hits and misses and simply say hit, miss, barely miss, and go on from that. Or to go the opposite direction and become exceptionally verbose and to lean too heavily on elaborate descriptions to try to convey what's happening in combat. The truth of the matter is that vast majority of times we don't need to expend a lot of time describing, or a lot of language to describe what happens in particular moments in combat. It's actually looking instead, if we want to really improve our combat description, it's realizing or recognizing the moments in which we can add a little bit more color, a little bit more texture to the combat description for that particular action because it has some significance. Or looking at moments in which we want to emphasize or reveal something that's critical for the players to understand about the encounter itself. And I think in general what the lesson here is that adding detail signifies or implies importance. And this is true not just in combat, but across the board in any type of description. If we want to invest detail in something, we're telling the reader, if we're writing something, or the player, if we're talking about the players at our table, we're telling these players that this particular detail matters, or there's something about this detail and what I'm telling you that matters. And if every single description of every single die roll is accompanied by detailed description, then we actually achieve the opposite. Then we drown in a wealth of information and detail, and in the end, nothing stands out. So in order to make things highlight, we actually have to downplay a certain amount of description and save it for critical moments, things that really we want to emphasize. So what types of things happen when we try to emphasize things in combat? What are we trying to emphasize? Well, I would say in general what we're looking at in our combat descriptions of particular actions in combat is we're really emphasizing the attribute or the scores that are in play. That is to say, if you're talking about, whether you're talking about the attacker or the target, if you want to emphasize power, well, if you want to emphasize the strength by which something's delivered, you're emphasizing power. If you want to emphasize agility and precision, that really is a reflection of the creature, the attacker or the target's dexterity. Tactics is a reflection of intelligence. Instincts, the reflection of wisdom. And charm is a reflection of charisma. Endurance, a reflection of constitution. So what we're really doing then is moment by moment, if the attack originates, the power source of the attack derives out of someone's physical strength, then that is the type of thing we want to emphasize in that particular combat moment. And if we want to emphasize instead that this is a creature, an enemy that relies on their agility, then that's what we're going to emphasize. So thinking about this, how do we achieve this? How do we create this balance so we are able to emphasize these things? When do we put the emphasis on the attacker? When do we put it on the target? And what are some of the other things that might come into play? So I'd say when we're thinking about focus then, we're thinking about really four things. We're focusing on the attacker sometimes in our descriptions. We're focusing on the target sometimes in our descriptions. We're focusing on the environment sometimes in our descriptions and its impact on how some action played out, whether it was a success or a failure, a hit or a miss. And then sometimes we're looking at the impact of others upon that particular moment. And that, I would say, good examples of that might be bardic inspiration, or sort of the aid or the benefit of some cleric spell or some other magical impact that aids you to transcend what would have been a miss. And so I think these are things to keep in mind. So now let's dive a little bit deeper into talking about attackers. Why are we focusing on the attacker? Usually it's because we want to emphasize the nature and the scale of the threat. And often we're talking about the attacker as being the enemy of the player characters. And so if we want to play up that enemy as being particularly strong, then what we're describing then is going to emphasize strength. And that will probably be a reflection of brutality, power, or sort of force. And so we might use that type of language in describing a hit. We might say that something was a particularly solid hit or forceful hit. We might say that the blow was heavy. We might say that he overpowered your defenses. We might say that he dealt a brutal or devastating blow. And those are things, it's relatively simple and small insertion into our description, but a keyword like solid or forceful or powerful or brutal tells us the attacker and the nature of the attack is strength, right? And then we know what we should be threatened by. In contrast, if the enemy is one that is particularly, and I'll say anytime you're talking about an attacker, often it's the enemy, but sometimes you'll want to emphasize the skill and the ability of the player characters themselves and let them shine, especially if this is a critical hit or this is a blow that somehow ends an enemy's life or turns the battle in some way. Then you might want to pan the camera back towards the player characters and let them shine in that moment of triumph because they've succeeded. Almost always you end up putting the focus on the attacker if the attack is a success. Usually you don't want to emphasize how badly your player characters are doing unless that is part of the combat. You want to emphasize the extreme power differential between the two forces. But in any case, let's get back to that topic of if we're not talking strength, if we're talking about power that derives from someplace else, like the enemy, the attacker is actually a dexterity-based attacker, one who is agile, who uses finesse ability, then we're looking at precision. We're looking at the language of a deft strike or a vicious blow, something that is a masterful strike, or sometimes we're speaking about the speed at which something is happening, so we talk about a swift strike. All these things emphasize agility and speed. If we were talking, we can talk about the attacker being able to outmaneuver the defenses of whoever the target is. If we're talking about a ranged attacker, then most likely we're going to speak about precision and speed. We're speaking of a caster, someone who draws upon divine, arcane, or natural magics, whatever it is. We will probably take our inspiration for the description of that attack by whatever school or domain that comes from. So if we know it's an illusion-based spell, then we were talking about whether or not someone believes or disbelieves, whether that illusion, that nightmare takes hold or not. If we were talking about necrotic powers, then that would be what we would describe. And it might be useful to sit down in advance for yourself and figure out, what is the way in which these different types, these schools of magic or domains of magic, types of magic, manifest themselves in your world. And so I might think to myself that eldritch energy or necrotic powers tend to manifest in sort of a dark purplish energy. And then I naturally know whenever the spell is cast, if I know it's necrotic, I know that I'm going to use that color code to aid my players in imagining this. And they start to say, I don't know what that spell is that's been cast, because I might not actually tell them the spell. I will just describe, sort of that manifestation. And then they will have some anxiety about, what is it? I think I know what it is. I'm terrified about what that might deliver, in the end. So that's one way to think about it. And if we're talking about magic, we're usually talking about control, and we're talking about mastery. And so, and precision, if it is something that's based on an attack roll. But if it's not based on an attack roll, it's about control and mastery. Does the caster have sort of the superior power in their control of magic, or in the amount of magic, or in the precision of magic that's being delivered in the attack? Okay, so that's really, if we're talking about attackers, those are the type of things we're considering. If we're talking about targets, often we're really talking about misses. Usually the camera swings to the target of the attack at that moment, and we're thinking about, oh no, do we get hit? And we might say something to the effect, we would probably focus on similar things, but use a different type of language. So again, if we're talking about misses, if our target is someone who derives their power from their strength or from their defensive abilities in terms of their armor, then we're really speaking of their ability to deflect, or to or that the blow was too light, or that it failed to penetrate, or that it was batted away, that it was somehow weak. When it comes to finesse, if the target is someone who relies on their agility and their dexterity, then it's going to be outmaneuvering that particular attack. So we might speak obviously of misses, but we'd also speak of that it went wide, you swung wide, and it avoided the blow, or it sidesteps, or it dodges, or your attack is too slow. If we're focused on the target, we're focusing on what does the target do to avoid or evade, or to lessen the impact through their agility. And if we're talking about missing from the point of view from an attacker, which we sometimes can't do, we can emphasize a clumsiness or a slowness or an inaccuracy, as opposed to, it's some of those things might work as well for strength-based ones. Ranged attacks usually turn out that, you miss is simply you miss, or that the target has evaded it, has ducked, or has dodged it, has anticipated it in some way. Casters, if we're talking about misses, almost always it's going to be from the point of view of the caster, because they have the most control over the magic at this point. But you could emphasize, the ways in which they block or deflect, especially if there is a counter spell involved. Then really it is, they effectively counter your magic. They defend themselves. They overwhelm your magic in some way, or your magic fails to penetrate their defenses. And we don't go into detail about that. But in general, I think what you find is, like, if you're talking about magic, most often both hits and misses are described from the point of view of the attacker, and not so much from the point of view of the target. We would talk about the targets on, let's say, a particularly successful attack roll, and then we would talk about the consequences. And that's really a previous episode. We've talked a little bit more about some of the cinematics of, like, describing a group of people affected by a particular spell, instead of trying to, like, negotiate every single roll in this way. Just think about all the rolls happening, and then you look at that scene and then play it out as a sort of a little cinematic cutscene that describes the aftermath of that spell attack. Okay, so I think these are the type of things I usually think about. The other thing I usually think about when I'm describing combat and particular dice rolls is I look at the dice rolls themselves, and think about, what does it actually tell me? Does it tell me that this is barely a hit, or that it barely misses? In which case, I might want to play up sort of the how near something was to either succeeding or failing, and make that part of the drama. And that would be sort of like an otherwise ordinary miss might mean more in that combat if we pause to kind of give it sort of that significance, especially if we are near the end of the combat and we have a sense that our enemy is on the verge of toppling over and we just can't seem to get there. And near misses or near hits can be everything in those moments. So why not play up on them? And a critical hit or miss is likewise sort of, a wonderful moment to play up in description. So whereas most of the time your combat might be described in terms of hits and misses, or simply, slightly modified versions of that, a solid hit or a deft strike or your quick rapid blows with your dagger, most of the time you can do very simple things like that. But then with that sort of optimal moment of precision, of a masterful strike, something that transcends sort of the moment, the combat stops, grinds to a halt, because we have this moment that pauses and we get a sense of sort of the severity or the fatality, the brutality of this particular attack. We want to pause. We want to give that a moment to describe what's happening. Now, I know that there are some game masters who subscribe to the theory that they should turn that around to the players and say, how do you do this? Matt Mercer's famous for doing this. And I think that can work for some gaming groups. Some players feel comfortable just improving a fatality, a death moment. But for newer players, that might be overwhelming. And for some people, it's just not in their bones to improv moments like that. And then they fumble and then they feel awkward about the whole thing. So I would actually say this is something that you gauge on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't overuse it because it can feel kind of trite and cliche if you're always pausing to say, how do you want to do this? Because it may not always be like the thing that people enjoy. And if you turn out to be a really great storyteller and narrator and have a very good understanding of what that player character's MO is in terms of how do they tend to want to finish things, you could even have a conversation in advance with the players and say, like, hey, what is it that your character tends to do in combat? What are they trying to accomplish? What would be an awesome hit for them? And kind of mine that for a little bit of information so that when you get to those moments, then it's just a natural extension of their character. If you know that they have a deep hatred of slavers, for instance, and this is a combat in which this is kind of the optimal foe for them, someone that they feel like they can just throw all their hatred and anger against, and that final blow has a satisfying quality to it, then that's what you play up, and you might do something that's like takes it a next step there. If they pride themselves on their precision and their deftness of strikes, that whether it's with a rapier or with a longbow, then maybe you play up the accuracy angle of it, or the quick rapid movements of a monk in a flurry of blows followed off by a devastating punch or knee to a skull, and you have that shattering moment. You can play off of these things, thinking about the characters, thinking about what they might enjoy or might believe they're, what would seem within their wheelhouse of things to do. But this again is sort of a negotiation, a talk that you have with your players to figure out where they are on that. If they want to do those scenes themselves, just kind of understand where the limits are on that. It's like, how real do you want your world to feel? How real do you want the combats to be? And do you give people so much leeway in terms of how they describe, an ending that it impacts other parts of the world, other parts of the combat? How much of that do you want to give that sort of the DM creative power over to the players? And that I think is just sort of, you have to gauge that, and you have to negotiate that with the group, figure out what makes sense, and you can test it out. So, like I said, some people feel comfortable turning that over and saying, "How do you want to do this?" when you get to the end, and other times it might feel more complete to offer it to them already done, in the sense that you give them on the fly this narration of sort of like the end of a combat. And if that is something that you're uncomfortable doing, or you just don't have a lot of experience, I would go back to either reading more of fantasy novels and people that describe these type of combats, or watching. I love watching sort of classic martial arts films and action films, because there is a great way in which they handle often the close of these combats, and thinking about, well, what makes for a compelling ending? What's a resonant ending to this particular moment? And playing off of that. So those are kind of the key things I think about: combat descriptions, action by action, die roll by die roll. Take your inspirations from the attributes and the traits and the abilities of the attackers and of the defenders, the targets. And then think about as well what we also can learn from the environment. Oh, I guess that's the other part I almost forgot to talk about. When we talk about combat, sometimes a miss or a hit can be described not as a consequence of the attacker's ability or the defender or the target's abilities, but instead in terms of interference from the environment itself. If they're fighting on a rickety bridge or an unstable platform, or upon an unsteady, constantly wavering ship deck, then you can play that up and say, like, he rolls out of the way, or he's thrown to the side and you barely miss him, or you're thrown off balance and cannot complete the strike, right? So there's a randomness to the environment, and there's also a precariousness and a lack of control, I think. And so sometimes misses and hits can come about because of things that are external. And speaking of external, the impact of others on the combat is another sort of area that you can draw on if you want to describe why someone hits or someone misses, especially if it's the result, if they barely succeeded as a result of the assistance, the magical assistance of someone else, whether it's bardic inspiration or it's some magical or divine aid. Their success is predicated on that magical boost, and you can play that up in your description and say, like, aided by the bard's inspiring words, you lunge forward and find a hole in the armor, plunging your dagger through, whatever it is. And so, like, I think in these moments too, we can look at, what are some external things that we might throw in there to explain why this is a success or a failure. So what I would say in the end is, this again is all a matter of practice. These principles, kind of key things, just stop and think about where you want your emphasis, where do you want the focus. Is it on the attacker? Is it on the target? Is it on the environment? Or is it on the impact that others have? And that might switch action to action, and you don't need to describe it every single time. Just pay attention to moments that you think, oh, that was a great moment. That was a fantastic roll. That was in the clutch. We got this awesome thing happening. Why not play that up in a particular way so that the players remember it and they feel like, yeah, that was this awesome moment. And I loved how the DM took the time to let us really enjoy sort of that moment, to make it something that we can take away and say, that was this great moment. I remember how he described it or how she described it. And I think, we've talked about this in terms of combat, but this also applies in terms of skill checks. And this applies in a lot of other ways. You can really play up on the cascading effect of successive failures or successive successes. So if you have like a sequence of great triumphs or great failures, they aren't isolated individually. They're actually the result, like you arrive at a final thing where that final role means everything because of everything else. And again, that's a moment that you can play up and think about what's at stake here. What ability scores are really at the root of this, and how do I play up on that? Thinking about them and thinking about what it tells me about the traits that are at play and how they succeed or fail. So anyways, that's this episode. Hopefully it answers a few questions about combat descriptions, gives you some new ideas about how to handle turn-by-turn descriptions and making the dice rolls mean a little bit more than just be numbers, more than just hit or miss, but communicate something back to the players to make their character actions even more meaningful. So if you've enjoyed this, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to this channel and check back often. I've been a little bit inconsistent about how often I upload new videos for this channel, but I am continuing to write and prepare material for this channel. So we will probably resume either a discussion of combat narration or go back. Well, actually, I've been thinking perhaps I'll move on to discussing sort of villain or NPC entrances or character NPC descriptions. But I think there's opportunities to play into these other descriptions as well. If you have a preference, something you would like me to tackle, please comment below and let me know. And I'll figure out where to schedule it in and to take it on. This whole series on combat descriptions came about because of a friend who suggested he wanted to know more how to do combat descriptions better. And hopefully I've answered some of his questions too. So until next time, stay safe, stay well, and keep rolling dice. And, well, keep tapping into whatever inspires you to create worlds and to inspire others to be the heroes or the villains that they've always wanted to be. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.